think it has become very important because there was an attempt in Durban to define that this new regime that was supposed to be a post-2020 regime, mainly on mitigation, would not have equity as the centerpiece of the regime. There was a big fight between Connie Hedegaard, as you would remember, and the Indian minister over what how equity would feature in the regime. And I think in the little huddle that happened on the last night of Durban, apparently Europe did not mind considering equity and common but differentiated responsibility in the context of the new regime. But Todd Stern of the United States said that will not fly. So the reason why it's become so important is that the developed world is beginning to shift a lot of the burden of the responsibility onto the developing world, and largely India and China, of course, looking at future emissions and looking at ignoring historical responsibility. In fact, you would have heard in the workshop Mr. Jonathan Pershing very clearly saying that the convention does not acknowledge historical responsibility, and that's was pointed out by Brazil, the Brazilian negotiator, quite clearly. It may not have used the word responsibility, but it did say that because of the historical emissions of developed countries, they must take a lead. That implies historical responsibility. And in Cancun, the Cancun decision refers under the mitigation of developed countries to historical responsibility. So Mr. Jonathan Pershing cannot run away from that.
So let's just run through. We've had this workshop that's lasted all day here in Bonn, slightly more than what most people would assume to be a workshop. It was basically a big plenary session with all the big important negotiators that are here in Bonn. Could you outline to us where you see the different positions? Because there were a number of different positions. India made some interesting points, China also, EU, and as you've just mentioned, Jonathan Pershing made quite an entertaining speech, and you roll your eyes, but it was quite an entertaining and passionate speech. You might not sort of agree with it, but can you outline to us briefly where you see those different players standing?
Well, I think there was one divergence that was quite clear, and that was that developing countries, mainly all the developing countries, were doing presentations, whether it was Egypt, whether it was India, whether it was Brazil, and then comments from the floor by a number of developing countries, and also the representative from the South Centre who spoke. And they all were saying that this workshop should not end in just being a mere workshop, that there is this increasing need to understand what equity means. And it was a very good effort today in terms of looking at where developing countries were coming from. You heard the delegate of Egypt sharing the experience of coming out of Tahrir Square and the demand of his young people for jobs and for economic opportunities. And he said that if I was going to talk to them about climate change, that would be a very difficult challenge, especially for a country with limited resources. And you also heard India talking about its own challenge in terms of the resource question. And basically, I think the South Centre also pointed that out, that if you had a poor person in a developing country who did not have access to energy, was using a polluting, burning stove, and the child was sick with HIV/AIDS, no health care, no access to education, and if you gave them $10, where would that money go? That money is not going to go to buy a climate-friendly cooking stove. It's going to go to save the child, feed the children, and so on. So that was the microcosm of an example translated into a budget of a country. So the point that I think that came very strongly and powerfully from developing countries is, for us there are development challenges. You have to acknowledge that. And to a large extent, the developed countries who have 20% of the population contributed to 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions for the increasing, warming of temperatures in the world. and developing countries having to face the consequences of that through adaptation. So given the development challenges and given these climate challenges, that if the developed world acknowledged that it was a primary cause of this problem, that it should take the 70% of the responsibility in transitioning and in enabling developing countries to do what they have to do in terms of meeting their sustainable development needs and meeting the climate change needs. So this is where I think the very important point I think that came out was that equity is the gateway to ambition. It was not an impediment to ambition, and equity is a prerequisite to ambition. If you wanted ambition without equity, you would not get it.
But on a final point, it does still seem clear that there are two very perhaps not very clear sides, but two sides to this, and the EU made a slightly more nuanced point than Mr. Pershing, but it was still very much going along the lines of, the developed world has its part to play, but you need us as much as anything. So do you still see there's a clear line between the two sides, and is this something that you think can be resolved?
I think it is a problem still. I don't think it was. The divisions are still clear. You were right, the EU was a little bit more nuanced. But if you heard what they said this, it was almost as if it's easy to decouple. They said that it can be done. And in fact, the way the EU framed it, he said that climate, if not addressing climate, would undermine sustainable development. Whereas what developing countries were saying is, to address climate change, development was a prerequisite. So it's like a chicken and egg. Now, the EU could say it because they, after historically polluting and gaining all the wealth and gaining the capacity and the technology and having the resources to enable it to move to a much more greener, sustainable way forward, you don't have that luxury in the developing countries because the carbon space has already been constrained. So what they are telling the developing world is, you have to do climate change mitigation and adaptation in a climate constrained world, and yet you can decouple that at a very cheap way, which nobody has shown until now how that can be done in a developing world. So I think what we need to acknowledge is, this is where I thought Egypt was very powerful, that you have to acknowledge that it's costly. It's not easy. And the fact that if you recognize that it's not easy, if you recognize that developing countries, none of them said they don't want to do mitigation or adaptation. They all said, yes, we acknowledge that we need to do, but we need the help in terms of the finance, in terms of the technology. That's where equity comes in. That how do you equitably help developing countries to go into sustainable development in a way that would ensure that they meet both the challenges of development and the environmental imperative of contributing less to greenhouse gas emissions.